Hi everyone. This is a brief lecture on the first four chapters of Thomas Nagel's little book, What Does It All Mean?, which is a nice little introduction to the subject of philosophy and some of the perennial problems that come up in the discipline. So in this brief account, we're going to look at three main things. First, solipsism and skepticism, which are distinct from each other, but Nagel discusses in tandem for reasons that we'll see. Second, the problem of other minds. And third, the mind-body problem, to which Nagel discusses three possible solutions. First, dualism, second, physicalism, and third, what he calls dual aspect theory. So let's begin with chapter 2, the first big chapter in the book, which addresses the question of how do we know anything at all? So Nagel begins by presenting a possible view known as solipsism, which is the view that my mind is the only thing that exists. So everything else, according to the solipsist, would merely be an idea in my own mind, right? So the idea that other people exist, the idea that there's an external world, the idea that there's a reality outside of my own mental processes, outside of my own thoughts. Now, Nagel is not a solipsist, but he presents this as a kind of foil to views that would want to say, well, of course we know some things outside of our own minds, but the question is going to be, how do we know that we know such things? This leads to the problem of skepticism, which can be presented in a variety of ways, but the type that Nagel talks about is skepticism about the external world. So the skeptic is someone who thinks that there's no way to know if there is an external world, and even if there is one, a world outside my mind, there's no way to know what it's actually like. So the problem is, and again, you can kind of illustrate this with a solipsist point of view. The problem is everything that I know seems to come from within my own mind, right? So all the perceptions that I have, all the evidence that I can assess, all the arguments that I might run through, these are all mental phenomena that I am thinking, right? These are all events that are occurring within my mind. And the question is, well, how do I know that there's a world outside my mind? And how would I know the nature of that world? So for example, there seems to be no guarantee that my perceptions of the supposed external world actually represent that world in an accurate way. So for example, maybe I'm hallucinating, maybe I'm dreaming. Nobody actually believes that, practically speaking, but philosophers want to know, do we have any good rational grounds for rejecting solipsism and skepticism? Maybe we do, but that's the challenge posed by these two types of views. Is there a way to refute views of this sort and to show, no, actually, we do know that other things exist besides just my own mind, and I can know what their nature is? So Nagel addresses this. He asks, well, can we actually refute these views without falling prey to circular reasoning? And he says, maybe not, right? This might be a sort of case where it's just impossible to prove that what common sense tells us is actually true. So again, common sense tells me that, of course, there's a world outside my mind, other people exist, I take that for granted, but can I prove that? Well, Nagel points out that I can't get outside of my own mind to check whether, for example, other minds exist. So am I the only mind in the universe? I assume not, but how would I know that? My only basis, it seems, to suppose that there are other minds is my experience of them, right? I seem to have this experience of other people existing and of there being an external world. But again, how do I know that that's not just a dream or an hallucination of some kind? If I could get outside of my own mind, I could check, okay, does my mind match up with reality? Or is there a reality outside my mind? The problem is I can't get outside my own mind. Even if I try to think of that, I am sort of imagining myself looking down upon my own thoughts. I have not really gotten outside of my own mental point of view. So it seems to be the case that all our perceptions of the supposed external world, so the world of rocks, trees, other people, buildings, that stuff that we take to be reality, all of my perceptions of that seem to be conditioned by my own mind. So the question is, can I ever have a good rational ground for thinking that my perceptions match up with a true external world, and that world actually answers to the perceptions that I seem to have. That's a hard problem, right? Committed skeptics are going to be people who think there is no way to prove that there is an external world, that precisely this problem prevents us from doing that, namely that we're kind of stuck within our own minds and we can't work outside of them. So there's no way to know what the external world is like, or indeed even if it exists at all. Now, Nagel points out that in a practical sense, no one believes in solipsism or skepticism. If you tried to live your life that way, it probably wouldn't work. It seems like we just have to take it for granted that, of course, there is an external world out there. But that's not really knowledge. That would just be an assumption, right? We can hold that opinion and hope that it's true, that there's a world outside of our minds, but that falls very far short of proof. And that's interesting to the philosopher because it means, if ends up being the case that we can't know these things, it turns out that we know very little, right? We know nothing beyond the contents of our own minds, which would be an interesting and maybe a depressing conclusion to reach. A similar problem arises, and we've already touched on it, when it comes to thinking about other minds. And Nagel discusses this in chapter 3. So the so-called problem of other minds is how can we know what's inside the minds of other people? So again, we take it for granted that we are not the only minds, you aren't the only thing that exists, that there are other people out there who have mental states of their own. So sometimes we say mental states are private, they're only known directly by the person who has them. And people on the outside, other people, can only perhaps infer the content or maybe guess at the content of other people's minds based on their behavior. So for example, you might say, based on someone's facial expression, that maybe they're upset about something, right? So we infer that they are having this feeling of being upset inside their own minds, but you don't literally have that feeling of theirs. You're just supposing that they have that feeling based on the facial expression that you're observing. But as Nagel notes, this is open to the same problem of skepticism, or the same kind of problem that he noted in chapter 2. Namely, how do I know that this facial expression really does, in this case, or any case, indicate the sort of feeling that I'm imagining? Again, it's something that perhaps we're instinctively inclined to do. We suppose that we can rely, usually, on our observations of people and make inferences to what's going on inside their minds in terms of their private mental phenomena. But again, how can we know that? How can we check that our inferences are actually leading to the truth in this case? More radically, how do we even know that other minds exist in the first place? So can we prove that other people out there are actually conscious beings in the same way that you yourself are? You might think, well, perhaps not, because the only reason that I know that my mind exists is because I have direct access to that. I know my own private mental states. I can experience them and feel them directly, or perhaps you would say, I just am some sort of collection of those mental states. But when it comes to other people, again, we are, according to the skeptic at least, just assuming that there are other minds in the heads of those other people, and that they're having private thoughts the same way that you yourself are. But again, how do I prove that? I can't really get outside my own mind and look inside theirs to check. I'm sort of trapped, so to speak, within my own mind, and that seems to open the problem of skepticism when it comes to the mere existence of other minds, much less what's actually going on inside those minds, should they happen to actually exist. Let's turn now to chapter 4, the mind-body problem. And this is simply the problem of trying to explain the relationship between the mind and the body. So roughly, what do we mean by these things? Well, the mind is a collection of your mental states, things like perceptions, memory, imaginations, beliefs, things like that. Again, those sort of private mental phenomena. Whereas the body would be the physical aspect of your being. So one question is my mind just my brain, or some part of my brain, or some process of my brain? Or is it perhaps the case that the mind is something non-physical, in which case it would be distinct somehow from the brain? if you say, well, mind and brain are distinct in some way, they're separate things, what exactly is the nature of the distinction and how are they connected? Right? Because it seems to be that our minds and bodies are connected. For example, you have a stressful thought that might cause your heart rate to increase. That seems to be a case of a mental event causing a physical event, right? So you have a mental cause and a physical effect. Also, you could have the reverse case. For example, you step on a nail, right? The nail makes an incision in the body. You feel that in your mind as pain. So it seems like there's a cause and effect relationship that goes both ways. Mind can affect body and body can affect mind. So it would seem like any reasonable solution to the mind-body problem would have to explain that connection. How is that possible? Well, let's look at the three views that Nagel discusses. First is dualism, and this is associated with philosophers like Descartes, going back to the old days, and maybe Plato on some interpretations at least. But the dualist is someone who thinks that mind and body are two separate things or substances. So the body, which includes the brain, is something physical, whereas the mind is something non-physical. You might think of it as a soul. It's something immaterial. There are questions about, okay, what exactly is an immaterial substance? People like Descartes just say, well, a mind is just a thinking thing, and that's all there is to it. It thinks, whereas bodies are physical things that do not think. This raises an immediate problem, however, and it goes back to what we just discussed. How can the dualist explain mind-body interaction? So again, it seems like the mind can have an effect on the body, and the body can have an effect on the mind. How is that possible if mind and body are two totally different kinds of things? So how could a physical phenomenon, so for example, stepping on a nail, how could that have a mental effect, the feeling of pain? And vice versa. How could a mental event, say the stressful thought, have a physical effect? For example, the increased heart rate. This seems pretty difficult for the dualist to explain, and it's often seen as kind of the main challenge, or at least one of the main challenges to the dualist point of view. There are, especially in early modern philosophy, some suggestions for overcoming this, some of which are pretty outlandish. So, for example, Leibniz has this idea that mind and body actually don't interact in a certain sense. It's just that they're like two clocks that are wound up to tell the exact same time. So it's not that your body causes pain in the mind, but rather your mind is just set up already to feel pain at precisely the moment when your body steps onto the nail. This is kind of odd, but it goes to show how difficult that problem is and how important people like Leibniz thought we need to say something, even if their answer isn't all that satisfying. So that's the dualist point of view. How about the physicalist view, which to many people nowadays seems more plausible, but has problems of its own? So the physicalist is someone who just thinks that mental states are ultimately reducible to physical states of the brain. There are different varieties of this, but the basic idea is that my so-called mind is really just my brain or some part of my brain or some process in my brain. On this view, there's only ultimately one thing or substance, a physical body. The idea of a soul or an immaterial mind is rejected by the physicalist. There's nothing like a soul or anything like that. So you might just say, well, isn't this in keeping with modern science? Doesn't this make sense? We know a lot more about the brain nowadays than we used to, although there's quite a lot we don't know. You might just say, yeah, it sure seems like the brain is what produces mental states, or what we call mind. So ultimately, mind is something physical. The big challenge for this is trying to explain how mental phenomena arise from physical phenomena. So sometimes, in particular, when it comes to consciousness, this is called the hard problem of consciousness. And in particular, the hard problem is trying to explain how physical matter bumping into each other, or bumping into itself, could possibly produce the consciousness and the sort of private, first-person mental states that we all seem to experience. Maybe there's a way to ultimately explain this, but many philosophers think that so far we haven't, right? We just say that neurons light up, they fire in the brain, and then you have consciousness. And it seems like there's a big gap there, right? How does this physical event, neurons firing, how and why does that actually produce consciousness? And does it really? To sort of see this, just imagine what it's like to have private thoughts of your own, right? You remember something, you experience a certain emotion, you expect something to happen in the future, you worry about something, whatever it is, that doesn't feel like a physical event, right? It just feels like a sort of series of events that's occurring in your mind. And if somehow those phenomena are ultimately physical, well, it sure doesn't feel like it, right? And the main challenge to physicalism will then be, okay, if you say that those private thoughts ultimately are or somehow depend upon physical events, how, right? It's up to you to explain that. And so far, at least many philosophers think, nobody really has. It's just sort of a hope that maybe someday we can physically explain mental phenomena, which maybe we can, but they don't think we have yet. So the jury remains out on that question. Finally, let's take a look at what Nagel calls dual aspect theory. So in the old days, this was called property dualism. And it's the idea that ultimately the brain is the seat of mental phenomena, but that mental phenomena are ultimately non-physical. So the brain is the thing, right? The ultimate substance that does a bunch of stuff, right? Fires neurons, and somehow that that physical series of events gives rise to the non-physical mental states that we're familiar with. So in this view, and this is why the name is what it is, the mind is an aspect of the brain. It's not a separate thing that can exist on its own. So this means, unlike with dualism, there's no thought that there's a mind or a soul that could possibly survive the death of the body. The mind depends upon the body, but on this view, the mind is not physical. It's a sort of non-physical event that is somehow produced by the physical phenomena of the brain. So the problem with this one, of course, is how does a physical thing produce something non-physical? So again, you have the problem of consciousness that, like the physicalist, the dual aspect theorist is saying that it's ultimately physical phenomena that are responsible for mental phenomena. But the difference is that the dual aspect theorist is someone who thinks that the mental phenomena are themselves not physical, whereas the dualist thinks they are physical. But how do you explain that? How and why would neurons firing, electrons in your brain doing a bunch of stuff, how and why would that produce a non-physical thing that we call thought? Secondly, the dual aspect theorist also has the problem of explaining the cause and effect relationship between physical and mental events. So like the dualist, because they think mind or thoughts are non-physical, it's unclear how non-physical and physical things could interact. So again, how does the body affect the mind on this view, and how does the mind affect the body? That's a tough question that, at least by Nagel's lights, has not been adequately answered. So let's just end with some open questions. Just to think about, does it actually matter if we cannot refute solipsism and or skepticism? To a philosopher, it's kind of troubling if we can't, but let's say you're an ordinary person. Why should you care? Does it really matter? Is just assuming that, of course, there's an external world and of course other minds exist. Yeah, we don't know that, but let's just run with that as an assumption. Maybe that's fine, right? So that's a question. How much actually matters about what, if anything, we can know from a philosophical point of view? Second, and this might sound like a strange question, what if all your friends are zombies? So philosophical zombies is a kind of thought experiment, but a zombie would be another human being that lacks mind. So think of the problem of other minds just like zombies in fiction, they don't have consciousness. They're not aware of what they're doing. They just sort of act automatically and try and eat people. That's what a philosophical zombie would be. We take it for granted that, of course, our friends and other people actually have minds and they have their own private thoughts. But again, how do we know that? And does it matter? Right? Again, what if we can't know for sure whether other people actually have minds? There's a possibility then that they're just zombies. Should that be troubling to us, or again, does it not matter? And there's a theme here. You can see, what practical difference does it make to believe in dualism, physicalism, or dual aspect theory? Do our views on, for example, the value of life change based on how we see that? Right? So some people have thought, well, if humans are just ultimately physical beings and that we just cease to exist when we die, we're the same as anything else in nature. There's no soul that survives death. There's no afterlife. Some people think where you stand on that makes a big difference. For example, your moral and ethical views. Of course, it also would have an impact on your religious views. If physicalism is true, then it seems like there is no afterlife, which would mean religions that say that there is would, on that physicalist view, have to be false. Okay, so that was just a quick overview of the issues that Nagel addresses. He's not in this book really giving us answers to these questions. He's trying to lay out to first-time philosophers what some of the perennial basic problems of philosophy are. Of course, many philosophers have tried to suggest solutions to these issues that we'll talk about in some future videos and that you can take a look at on your own if you're interested. But before that, we have to first understand what the problems are. All right, so thanks, and I'll see you next time.